All right, we are back with part 2 of my interview with John Butler. He's the man that says a return to the gold standard is inevitable, and he says so in his latest book called The Golden Revolution. We have part 2 of the interview now. John, thanks for joining me again. I want to take up from where we left the discussion yesterday, and I'd like to know, if we do have a return to the gold standard, which country do you think would do it first?
I think there are a number of potential candidates. That said, I don't claim to have any insider knowledge about who is most likely to do this or not. But if you simply step back and look at those factors that would encourage a country to take it seriously, they're the following. Running a current account surplus, that is, being a net creditor nation to the rest of the world, would be one important factor. The second important factor would be to have already accumulated at least a small gold reserve, if not a large one, relative to your own economy. And the third one, and this is arguably the most interesting, the third one would be that you felt that you were actually in good company, and that if you made that first move, you would influence and quickly be joined by other countries such that you would not find that your own terms of trade were shifting so dramatically, but that a group of countries actually sense around the same time that it's in their own best interest to move collectively back to some form of gold pegging. That's the way it happened in the 1870s when the world moved on to the so-called classical gold standard, and that's how I think it's most likely to happen again today.
So who would you put in those categories, John? Country names?
For the most part, your primary commodity producers. So for example, your big oil producing nations and your very efficient manufacturing nations, in particular in Asia, for example. They've accumulated very significant current account surpluses. They're very competitive economies, and they simply produce things the world needs and wants. So it's only natural that in return for what they provide the rest of the world, they should require payment in something which cannot be arbitrarily devalued or manipulated by some other country with which they may not always have friendly relations.
So, John, what are the chances of a China-Russia agreement that could threaten the U.S. dollar?
Well, China and Russia have been slowly, gradually cozying up to each other for years. At these BRIC summits, which occur now on a regular basis, they issue these BRIC declarations, which are joint diplomatic declarations about what is in all of their collective best interest. And it's astonishing just how shocking, how provocative the last two declarations have been. The BRICS have directly assailed the monetary policies of the developed economies. They directly assail the fiscal policies of the developed economies. They accuse the developed economies of destabilizing their economy. More and more countries are refusing to cooperate with the existing financial and monetary policy regime. So I think it entirely plausible that not just China and Russia, but the other BRICS and a handful of smaller countries that share similar interests are actively working behind the scenes to lay the groundwork for an alternative to this fiat dollar reserve standard, which they increasingly believe is not in their interest.
So what power shift would have to happen in the U.S. for them to even contemplate going back to a gold standard?
Well, the power shift could either happen domestically or it could happen abroad. The fact is, if the rest of the world is moving in that direction and the U.S. says, no, we're terribly sorry, we're not going to cooperate, well, then the dollar will lose reserve status entirely. There'll be a run on the dollar. The U.S. will have to impose capital controls, and it will be an economic disaster, making 2008 look like a cakewalk. So, yes, if the U.S. decides that it wants to take the initiative, you're absolutely right, there will have to be a domestic power shift. Well, let's face it, there'll be a lot of education involved here, because right now, both the monetary and fiscal authorities in the United States are behaving as if, yeah, okay, they have some issues to sort out, but those issues can be sorted out domestically. I mean, I hate to say this, but the rest of the world does not share that view. It's increasingly obvious the rest of the world does not share that view. And so the U.S. will have to undergo a truly surprising, astonishing change of orientation to thinking it is the single most important issue. Until that happens, it is just not conceivable that the U.S. would, in fact, undergo that, some sort of domestic, ground up policy transformation that is simply in no way in evidence at the moment.
All right, John, let's get back to some counterpoints on your theory. Do we have enough gold in the world to actually back up a return to the gold standard?
Well, the supply of gold may be finite by weight and volume, but certainly not by price. And in fact, that's exactly how the gold standard worked historically. When government policies became less sustainable and less credible, the price of gold would go up. And it would help to balance the system out because people would reduce their holdings of paper currencies and government debt and increase their holdings of gold. And it works in reverse. When government policies become more credible and more sustainable, people will sell their gold. Why? Because they'd like to earn interest on government debt and they'd like to earn interest on other non-gold securities. So it's a self-regulating mechanism. Now, starting from where we are today, I fully admit that the current spot gold price, were that to suddenly become the monetary standard for the world, yes, that would imply a horrific deflation. I fully accept that. All that means is that as the world moves back towards credibility, back towards trust, away from this arbitrary manipulation of money, which is rapidly approaching its conclusion, the gold price will rise. And it will rise enough such that when governments finally do decide that the best decision to make is to link to gold in some explicit way, it will no longer be deflationary. It will provide stability.
So, John, a return to the gold standard could push gold to which prices?
Well, I mean, gold tends to trade in dollars. And if we're thinking in dollars, then if you want to try and reduce the U.S. Money supply and debt to a ratio vis-a-vis gold, which historically was stable and credible, you're talking about something probably in a range of $10,000 or even higher in the event that the U.S. does not very quickly rationalize its government finances at sort of the current level, as it were, and stops running these double-digit deficits. So you're talking about an order of magnitude higher. And again, people sometimes push back when I make this argument and they say, John, come on. I mean, are you serious? Is the price of gold really going north of $10,000? And my answer to that is twofold. Number one, when it becomes clear to the world that indeed there will be a move back to gold and people will be allowed to use gold for cross-border balance of payments transactions or for collateral in the banking system, simply the fact that it's that much more useful for these things will propel the price higher. That's number one. And number two, look, people, the supply of money, the supply of credit, these are the things that have grown exponentially ever since the US went off the gold standard, and by implication, of course, the world went off the gold standard. If you express disbelief in a $10,000 or higher price of gold, why not express disbelief in just how exponential the growth of money and credit has been over the past couple of decades? That's what should result in disbelief. The supply of gold has remained essentially unchanged. It's the supply of money and credit that has gone through the roof, which has caused an endless series, or up to this point, endless series of bubbles, bailouts, and a monetary policy which the world increasingly regards as not in its best interest.
John, what do you think right now is the biggest threat to the US dollar?
Well, the biggest threat is the regime itself. I don't think people fully understand just to what extent the regime has become unstable. There are just too many players in this game who perceive that their interests are changing. And you might argue that nobody wants to be the one to pull the trigger and to cause the disruption that invariably would occur in the event that the world were to ditch the dollar, as it were, and move back to gold. But I hate to say this, that argument is kind of like saying that a war will never happen, that no one will be willing to actually fight a war because it's so destructive. History instructs otherwise. History instructs that when the interests of nations collide in a major way, decisions will be made that occasionally result in hardship for some, in some cases for all, but they simply do result. In this particular case, I actually believe that because the system itself is so fundamentally flawed, that a move back to gold is salutary. But that's just my humble opinion. You might think it won't be salutary. It's beside the point. It's inevitable. It is going to happen.
All right, John, with the time I have left, want to ask you, a return to the gold standard could happen in what time frame? 1 year, 5 years, 10 years?
I would be surprised if the world will muddle through another 5 years without at least one country, more probably a handful, already moving back to gold and forcing the issue on those that resist it, but eventually are dragged along kicking and screaming if that's what it comes to. It's more possible, in fact, that depending on what choices are made in the near term, that timetable could accelerate. Look, as far as I can tell, when I look around the world, people talk about austerity an awful lot. They talk about rationalizing government finances a lot. But in fact, they're not delivering very much. And at the rate we're going, 5 years may not be what it takes. It might be more like 1 or 2.
Okay, John, so I know you were alluding to it before, but I'm going to get you to say it. If you had to pick one country to do it first, who would it be?
Oh, it's funny that you put it that way. I actually, again, I think it's more likely to be a group of countries who make some sort of deal together. But if there was a country that had just had it with the United States and just lost patience and wanted to sort itself out and wasn't afraid, as it were, of moving back onto gold, I think it is most likely to be either China or Russia.
All right, John, thank you so much. I urge all our viewers to pick up a copy of your latest book, The Golden Revolution. It's a great read. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thanks, Daniela.
And thank you for watching this edition of On the Spot. If you have any questions, you can email me at newsfeedback@kitco.com. For Kitco News, I'm Daniela Cambonin.